Welcome back to the afternoon session of day 2 of this amazing gathering. Hello to those joining us online, and thank you for being with us, whatever time of day it is for you. And thank you to Kate, our online facilitator. You okay? Please do reach out to Kate if you are online for questions and input during the session. Oh, hello everyone online. We can see you now. Before I go any further, I too would like to just echo the acknowledgement that we are on Yagara and Turrbal land, the land that I grew up on, and pay my respects to the elders and custodians of this land, and extend my respect to any and all First Nations people here with us today and joining us online as well. So this is the first session of our Making Music in Detention theme. We've got a keynote on this theme coming up next, so make sure to stick around for that. And we've got a panel of inspiring speakers from around the world coming up to discuss with us the challenges and opportunities of making music in contexts of incarceration. So here with us in person, we have our very own Alexis Kallio sharing with us some provocations about music in youth justice or in youth justice settings. And then joining us online, we'll have Elsa from the University of Automa, hopefully I've said that right, of Barcelona, to give us a bit of a historical perspective. And lastly, we've got Silke from the Free University of Brussels, who'll be talking about the kind of how, why, when and for whom of participatory music making in prisons. So check out the SIMM program for each presenter's detailed bios, but I think we should jump straight in. We all know how this works by now. We'll have 10 minutes for each of our presenters, and our presenters online have kindly submitted their videos, so we'll stream those and then we'll have plenty of time for a good hearty discussion afterwards. So can I invite Alexis to start?
Thanks, Emma, and it is a real pleasure to be here in my home institution at my first SIM. I would like to express my gratitude and respect for the Yagara and Turrbal people on whose lands I live and work, people who have cared for this land and its cultures, stories, music, knowledge, and law for millennia. This is, and has always been, Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge that my thinking is heavily indebted to Sami scholars and friends from the other side of the planet, and extend my respects to all First Nations colleagues joining us here at SIM. My work at the moment examines how we might harness the social impact of music making to keep young people out of custody, support positive identity and social development, foster connections to culture and community, and listen to youth voices in different and often profound ways. Now, unfortunately, I'm not here to suggest that we have a magic recipe where we can just add music and fix all of the problems that young people face after lifetimes of adverse childhood experiences, disrupted education, socioeconomic disadvantage, physical and mental health issues, and substance misuse. Music also does not solve the problems of systemic inequity, where in Queensland, where we meet today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander youth are detained more than 40 times the rate of their non-Indigenous peers. Nor can music ever adequately respond to the all too frequent reports of abuse, human rights violations, and torture that have come to characterise youth justice systems in this country. However, music does do something, and it's increasingly acknowledged to be a powerful arena for incarcerated young people to process trauma, build confidence, self-esteem, and a sense of accomplishment, learn professional skills, develop a sense of autonomy, improve self-regulation and emotional control, enhance capacity to engage in and persist with learning, generate a sense of hope and goals for the future, as well as establishing trust between themselves and peers and also authority figures. But it's also fair to say that music can't always do all of these great things. and is maybe a little bit more complex than that, particularly as music relates to issues of race, gender, class, and so on. I was very happy before that we heard Sarah talk about 1-4 and some other artists, which exemplify this really nicely, I think. Situating these music programs within contemporary criminological theory, we do know that music interventions that aim to address risk or change the child may perpetuate deficit narratives that only exacerbate inequity and entrench cycles of disadvantage. Rather, if we align the work of musicians with desistance theories, music may provide young people with unique skills and spaces to explore and express who they are and who they're becoming, and where and with whom they belong. Central to desistance theories are two main ingredients. The first is agency, the ability for youth to exercise voice and self-determination in decisions regarding their own lives, and self-efficacy, those feelings of success and young people's belief in their own development. While desistance is a self-directed process, it's also situated and profoundly affected by social context. In the study I'm telling you about today, I was particularly interested in how musicians and the detention centre setting influence these musical affordances for desistance, how these environmental or relational dimensions might influence and shape what music can do, and maybe what it can't. I'll share with you my findings from interviews conducted with 3 musicians working with the Australian Children's Music Foundation, one of the primary providers of music in youth detention centres around Australia. I'll call these musicians Sean, Richard, and Warren. All of these musicians have had highly, and continue to have, highly successful performing careers in jazz, folk rock, and country music, respectively. And they'd been working in detention centres through the work of ACMF for 10 months, 2 years, and 12 years. The 2 interviews that I conducted with each of these musicians focused on their aims and their ways of working, and how their ways of working in the detention centre setting shaped young people's opportunities to experience agency and self-efficacy through music making, or how they shaped musical affordances for desistance. So turning first to the idea of agency. Both Sean and Warren emphasised that they were never provided with, nor did they want, any information about young people's offending histories or reasons for being incarcerated. They both saw this as important for opening new pathways for young people to redefine themselves in and through music. In enabling young people to narrate their own identities and the trajectories in which they were heading, it was considered by all musicians to be extremely important to young people to have ownership and decision-making power with regards to what music they learnt or wrote. This, however, was achieved to varying degrees and was mediated by musicians' own skills and knowledge, young people's own abilities, not only musical, as well as the setting in which they were in. For example, Sean explained that in a recent session, the kids had asked to play an Ed Sheeran song. Now, as a highly accomplished jazz musician, Sean just about knew who Ed Sheeran was, did not know the song. And when he was working in the lower security setting, which was in a sort of school environment, then he had access to YouTube and the internet, and he could download, a music clip, or he could download some tabs and use his ears, as he liked to say, like a party trick that the kids thought was really impressive. But when he was in some of the more higher security settings, he had no access to the internet or technology, couldn't take in a recording device, couldn't take in a playback device. So he felt a little out of his depth. As a country musician, Richard, on the other hand, said that he was familiar with most of the repertoire that the young people often wanted to learn and play. Quite interestingly, this was not the sort of popular music that we so often associate with youth culture, but music by artists such as the 1960s crooner Charlie Pride or 1980s group Warumpi Band. Richard explained that this was the music that was playing loudly in their family homes, the songs that they listened to with their mum and dad. That's a connection. It's sort of bringing them back to when they were with family. In this way, it wasn't only the detention setting that mediated these affordances. Young people could use music to mediate the detention centre context as well, which David Lindsay describes as an effective abolition, a refurnishing of the carceral space as the pains of imprisonment are temporarily abolished and the auditory environment is rejected or replaced by sound created through the participants' own agency. Richard illustrated this as those brief moments when kids are making music, he explained, they're forgetting about being in here. They're forgetting about all the shit that happened yesterday or before, and they're not thinking about all the shit that might happen later. They're thinking about what's happening right now. So that already is a game changer. How musicians provided these experiences for young people changed weekly, with some children meeting with them for months on end, and others coming only once, as detention centre populations are extremely transient. Musicians described needing to identify and respond to a wide range of abilities, which meant that they had to come and kind of meet the kids wherever they were at and shift their goals from musical aspirations to enjoyment and inclusivity. Sometimes this meant working with young people until they could play a single chord and felt that sense of like, yeah, I did that. Other times it was just trying to leave the hypervigilance of a youth justice life behind for 10 minutes, just to focus for 10 minutes, and next week maybe trying for 12. Experiences of self-efficacy did not always manifest as musicians expected. There were not always those exclamations of like, yeah, I can do it, or beaming smiles. Sean described his work with one young man who rarely gives you eye contact. He's almost looking at you from the side. It's almost as if he's lost the ability to admit any sort of enthusiasm or an ability to show any sort of vulnerability of not being able to do anything or know something. So turning up every week was a huge achievement, with Sean being very cautious to push for more engagement until this young man felt safe and ready. In these ways, music may play an important role in the desistance processes of incarcerated youth, but maybe not always in the ways that we think it does. As ACMF musicians focused on the quality of experiences that they made possible for young people rather than any musical, social, or academic outcomes, music programs were not rehabilitative interventions, but rather creative spaces where young people could exercise agency and experience self-efficacy, but at their own pace. These affordances enabled youth to manage the pains of incarceration by mediating the affective environment of the detention centre itself, while also generating musical connections to home and to family. Self-efficacy among young people was witnessed by musicians not only musically, but also through an increased capacity to focus, which maybe aligns with the mediation of the sonic atmosphere and the environment of the centre, and an ability to have fun in a context that doesn't really allow for those experiences that easily. And I think this raises an interesting question, and one that I'd like to end with. The musicians interviewed described a whole host of challenges, but one of them was their own place and music's place within these settings. Warren told me about numerous times that he'd arrived to the entrance gates only to be told, sorry, we've just locked down the kids, music's off. Sean felt as though he wasn't really on anybody's radar. He said, if I didn't turn up for a month, I don't think anyone would notice. Music seems to be something that's dependent on the efforts of individuals rather than the system. Coming back to Lindsay's notion of affective abolition, we might begin to understand why this is so. With multiple and conflicting ideas about welfare and punishments, treatment and control, moral danger and willful criminality, so continuing to circulate around both youth justice policy and practice, we can see this really clearly in Queensland, where we have tough on youth crime, political rhetoric, and further severing of connections by suggesting that we send young people even further away to bush boot camps. So as one of the few creative spaces available to many of these kids, music opens a new imaginary, one that might be dangerous to extend to the system's level. This is dangerous not in the sense of danger to community safety from youth crime, but in its potential to disrupt the systems that discipline our understandings of adolescence, that uphold colonial immoralities and neoliberal exploitation. Putting the best interests of the child at the centre of systems change demands a reckoning as to our own roles as change agents. As Richard asked, what if the whole youth justice system was like a music program, where kids learned things that made them more resilient, actually assisted them in making their own decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and I can't wait to unpack some more of that at the end when we get to talk. Matt's kindly going to put up the video from our next panellist, Elsa, and I hope Elsa's with us online, but we'll get their pictures up at the end, so take it away. The video just takes a little moment to get into it, so it's not a glitch.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Elsa Calero, and I'm glad to be with you in this wonderful conference. I would like to express my greetings to the organizing committee and the scientific committee for letting me know, for letting me to stay with you and to share with you my findings about prisons in Franco, Spain. I regret I can't be in present with you, but I'll be there with your questions after this presentation. Franco's death in 1975 marked the beginning of a democratic era in Spain, breaking the silence that had characterized his repressive politics. This transition process has been described by several authors as a form of dialogic forgetting. Alida Asman suggests that this kind of democracy consists of a model for peace designed and agreed upon by two parties connected through past actions of mutual forgetting. Despite this post-dictatorship denial politics, former prisoners have been actively producing an array of commemorative literature, including autobiographies, diaries, and memoirs. Over the past 2 decades, many historians have defended the use of such texts to better understand people's living conditions under Franco's regime. Accordingly, prisoners' experience have served to complement the official discourse. Unfortunately, Spanish musicology has largely overlooked the wealth of these sources, as the discipline has not been particularly active in applying critical theoretical concepts to music during the Franco era. To dive into the prison's musical practices, the communication relies both on the official and unofficial documents. On the one hand, I have consulted the official records of the regime, such as laws, like Boletín Oficial del Estado, Boletín Oficial de la Dirección General de Prisiones, the Penitentiary Journal Redención, and other kind of documents such as memoranda, lists of activities, statistics, and yearbooks. On the other side, I have had access to 37 autobiographies written by the inmates that include references to music. Also, I have referred to documentaries recorded from 2007 and 2019, in which several former prisoners were interviewed about their daily life in prison. Even though music was not the main subject of those interviews, former inmates recalled the songs they used to perform both officially and unofficially. Finally, this kind of sources in which I rely are the interviews I conducted between 2015 and 2020 with 10 former prisoners and their families. Oral testimonies pose various difficulties. First, there are few surviving testimonies, as most of the former war detainees have passed away. Another challenge emerges in the way the interviewees remember and talk about their prison experience. Former prisoners frequently experience feelings of shame and guilt, making it challenging for them to acknowledge their participation in official musical practices while they were convicted, faced execution. Given the fragmented nature of the sources and the complexity of the topic at hand, this communication revisits philosophical, sociopolitical, and musicological concepts to shed light on musical practices in prisons. Specifically, I will draw upon two concepts introduced by the French philosopher Foucault. The first is his characterization of the penitentiary system of the modern state as a manifestation of power. The second, which I employ to understand how musical activities figure in the inmate's construction of the self, relates to Foucault's structuralist definition of space. According to him, we live inside a set of relations that delineates sites which are irreducible to one another and absolutely not superimposable on one another. Just as Pedro Oliver points out, the sense of belonging to a homogeneous group inside prison is the outcome of the adaptation of the prisoners to their environment, which determines prisonization, the third concept I used here. Finally, the roots of music in the memory of the inmates are also discussed in relation to the points of view of authors who argue that cultural artifacts are linked to identity. By the end of the Spanish Civil War, the number of Republican detainees exceeded 3,000. Paul Preston and Hugh Thomas note that during the first decade of the post-war era, death rates in prisons were unusually high. Innumerable inmates lost their lives to starvation, disease, ill treatment, and physical abuse, together with executions ordered by martial court. Such extreme conditions were even harder for women. Many were raped or incarcerated either pregnant or with their babies. None were provided with essential hygiene items such as sanitary towels, nor underwear or nappies for their children, resulting in a heightened risk of infection. Amidst this deprivation and killing, Franco started a propaganda program to re-educate its prisoners. Only 10 months after the coup d'etat, the government of the rebel side published a decree through which it regulated the work of war prisoners. This decree involved music as a punishment and propaganda device inspired by the practices of the totalitarian regimes of the time. In 1938, the Director General de Prisiones, the General Superintendent of Prisons, Máximo Cuervo Radigales, together with the Jesuit José Antonio Pérez del Pulgar, promoted the program of Redención de Penas, redemption of penalties. This program was inspired by European fascist policies aimed at educating the prisoners through forced labor and propaganda indoctrination. Under this program, male prisoners who complied with the state, such as engaging in official musical activities, were eligible for reduced sentences. Therefore, official musical practices in prisons serve as means of both indoctrination and humiliation towards the defeated. The establishment of a sonic system that humiliated prisoners through the compulsory singing of state marches and the prohibition of their own songs was intended to dehumanize them, reducing them to mere vibrating objects. This oppressive environment deprived them of the ability to even envision their own freedom. Apart from the propaganda speeches were the musical contents. This was a more subtle way of reinforcing the inequality system. They work as a shaming ceremony as well, where the ones who have contravened the existing order were hardly punished for it, being forced to listen not only the official hymns and marches, but the music programs designed by the regime to enrich its own culture. So far, these music programs included a revision of the musical repertoire from the Middle Ages in the case of religious music, and a revival of the 19th century for the rest of music. This selection was therefore a question of rebuilding the national Catholic relationship in a sonic way, and in this sense, both the Middle Ages and the Spanish 19th century symbolized the church-state union on what the regime's politics was based. To this purpose, some authors were recovered. So when analyzing what kind of music was performed in those broadcasts in prisons, we can make a distinction between the state music, the marches, and the other musical expressions, popular and classical music, like the ones aforementioned. In the case of the folk songs, were very important the writings of the Spanish ethnomusicologist Eduardo Martínez Torner and Agapito Marazuela Albornoz. First, marches and hymns were an extension of the political propaganda. The lyrics, which were always enclosed with triumphal sounds, illuminated the discourse of Francoism upon victory. Beyond that, the constant listening to such sounds by the inmates created a climate of violence in which a social identity was built. Prisoners were congregated around the Spain under Franco utopia. By being forced to listen to hymns like Cara al Sol, whose verses praise the victory of Francoism in Spain, or Oriamendi, which underline the pillars of the Francoist state, gold and homeland, they were openly taught that their sacrifice was for nothing, and so they were treated. They were nothing but listeners. They were nothing but singers of other one's victories. More complex is the question in regards to other kinds of music. Although Francoism never developed a musical theory linked to its moral, the promotion of some authors, among others, or the selection of determined genres and styles illuminates what this aesthetic purpose might have been. Following the aesthetic path of Vatican masses, these events included anthems and motets with religious content prepared for the liturgy, as well as to reinforce the Catholic devotion upon the prisoners. In this sense, the musical works composed by the Italian composer Lorenzo Perosi were especially relevant in the reinforcement of the Catholic devotion upon the prisoners. Perosi's music was influenced by his deep knowledge of the Gregorian chant and the polyphonic works of the 16th century. He attached great importance to the text and designed a religious music to be performed only in temples given its devotional meaning. For that reason, his masses were of great interest of the prison's authorities, who believed that only a music where Catholic principles were the main character of the composition was able to indoctrinate prisoners. Folk songs were also a key piece of the Francoist musical conception, through which the state praised the moral values of the homeland. In the years that followed the post-war era, the government took on a project collecting traditional songs from the villages of the country to spread the idea of the necessity of return to the land again. For Francoism, the boundaries between lyrics and ideology were fundamental, as the lyrics bring together the principal aspects of ideology. However, the strategies to pursue its own utopia with national prospects did not only rest upon the presence of lyrics. In this sense, instrumental music exemplified the usefulness of the absence of words when spreading political ideas. So musical auditions in prisons were monopolized by an essence that could be defined and identified with those violent states that ritualized through music the punishment exercised upon its defeated. Classical music fueled the atrocities committed in prisons during work and even sometimes during tortures and executions. However, the most relevant aspect is that it was there filling the bodies and minds of the prisoners who could not do anything to avoid such violation of their bodies and the inner self. Prisons serve as spaces characterized by a distinct authority environment that constantly reminded those within its walls of their location, instilling fear and terror. The intertwining of carceral violence and acoustics manifested multifaceted ways. As shared through the oral testimonies of former prisoners, sound played a crucial role in shaping the power dynamics within Franco's prisons. Due to their confinement in darkness and enforced silence, prisoners develop a distinct and heightened sensitivity to sound. The echoes of footsteps are the creaking of doors, the opening and locking, the patter of rain, the howling of wine, the buzz of insects, the squealing of rats, the voices of the guardians, the piercing sounds of shotguns. Each of these sounds shape their experience of space and time. In the pursuit of creating an unofficial sonic environment, prisoners sought out spaces that fulfill their need for both security and symbolic significance tied to the rituality of the music practice itself. They organized musical events in various locations such as toilets, workshop cells, courtyards, isolation cells, and even in front of the walls of the cemetery. Public confrontations represented by protest repertoire were often sung in corridors and courtyards, while more intimate and personal repertoire was typically performed in toilets, bedrooms, or even isolation cells. The cemetery walls symbolize the intersecting boundaries between musical practice, physical space, and self-identity. In such proximity to death, prisoners found solace in singing and shouting the songs and chants that were forbidden within the prison. By performing in front of the execution squad, they openly confronted their impending loss, acknowledging the potential sacrifice of their lives and the violation of their bodies. This act of singing became a defiant expression of resilience in the face of impending doom. Nowadays, music is still present on the life of Spanish prisoners as an art form of redemption, as a part of the pro-freedom events developed by the detainees. Musical events take place in detention centers as a part of the cultural and art therapy programs developed to help prisoners to cope with the anger, shame, despair, and sadness of the detention. On the other hand, music has become a refuge for detainees through which they can cry out loud their claims, fears, and feelings. Many thanks for your time, your attention, and now I will be glad to answer all your questions.
Thank you, Elsa, and I can already start to kind of hear some synergies between what's being spoken about then and what Alexis was sharing with us. So our next speaker is Silke. She's also put a video up for us, so we'll watch that and then we'll have a good discussion.
So good day, everybody. I am Silke Marynissen. I'm a PhD researcher connected to the research group Participation and Learning in Detention at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels in Belgium. And I'm doing a PhD on participatory music programs in prisons. So participatory music programs in prisons, what are they? I've done interviews with different key stakeholders, such as academics, and this person defines or divided participatory music programs in participatory, something that people are very much involved in, a type of very active music making, whether that is both playing an instrument or songwriting. And then on the other hand, you have program, which this person defined as something that is quite structured, something that is delivered, formally organized through the prison or through the education board or through maybe some other volunteer organization. And in my PhD research, we very much align with this idea of participatory music programs in prisons. So we focus on formally organized activities that are most of the time organized within group. So we focus on group activities and where people take up a very active music making role. And based on a literature review, we saw that previous research already focused a lot on the outcomes of music programs in prisons. But that limited research actually looks at, okay, well, how do these outcomes then arise and why do they occur? And is it for everyone the same? And then under which circumstances do these arise? So that's actually the focus within my PhD research. And for this, I use what is called a realist science lens, which is used to evaluate complex interventions or programs, and they use ontological depth. And this is often illustrated, or they use a metaphor of an iceberg. So you see the tip of the iceberg, which is the observable reality, but you don't see or you can't observe directly the big chunk of ice underneath the water. But there's still a big chunk of ice that is underlying underneath the outcome, and those are the underpinning mechanisms. But it's also very important to look at the context. Context is everything in the backdrop of an environment. For instance, when you look at this metaphor of an iceberg, and due to global warming, temperatures are rising, so your observable reality, the tip of the iceberg, is getting smaller, but also the big chunk of ice underneath is getting smaller. So it's all changing. So in my research, I look at context. So everything in the backdrop of an environment in which a program is implemented, that then activates certain underlying mechanisms. And in a program, these are the resources offered and the way that then people respond to these resources. And then the interaction between context and mechanisms triggers certain outcomes. And for data collection, I've started with a realist literature review of 34 documents. So I really looked with this realist science lens to the documents, tried to find out, okay, what has already been written about the outcomes for incarcerated individuals taking part in these programs, the mechanisms and contextual factors, what is already known, what has already been documented. And building upon those findings, I started conducting theory gleaning interviews with then international key stakeholders, such as academics and program developers. And this gave me a more in-depth insight into, okay, the underlying processes and how and why these programs work. And then to further refine those findings, I did participant observations of 4 participatory music programs in UK prisons. And this gave me already some very interesting results. Due to the time limits, I only share some of these results with you today, and those findings are still preliminary, meaning that I will further refine them in the rest of my PhD research. And we divided the results based on the 3 core elements within realist science, so outcomes, mechanisms, and contexts. And for outcomes, we saw 4 outcomes for incarcerated individuals taking part in these programs. The first one is the fact that they manage and express their emotions. It's about connecting to and expressing deep-seated emotions, but also coping with negative emotions. For instance, during the observations, I listened to a lot of original songs, and those songs were about, for instance, homelessness, about the loss of a family member, about anger towards the parents. So there's a lot of emotions within those songs. A second outcome is the fact that it provides respite, meaning that these activities are very absorbing, distracting them from prison life or from sorrows or from problems they're coping with. A third outcome is the fact that it facilitates self-development, meaning that it supports identity transformation and people start developing skills, and it can be musical skills, but also more transferable skills, such as listening, because they need to listen to one another when they're making music, or communication, talking to each other, working together. As a last outcome, there is facilitating connections. Connections between the participants, so the ones who participate in programs, but also connections between participants and the music facilitator, or for instance, connections between the participants and their family or friends, because they have something positive to talk about, or because if there's a CD at the end, they can show something that they've worked on. But the question is, okay, well, how do these outcomes for incarcerated individuals then arise? What are underlying processes? And one of the mechanisms that we found as very important is the approach of the music facilitator. They apply this compassionate approach where they're very authentic, they're respectful, they're non-judgmental, they're very trustworthy, and where they see people as human beings, as musicians, and not as their crimes. And for instance, this program developer, this quote of this program developer states that this person always uses first names, because in prison you will never find inside people calling residents by their first name. The music facilitators also uptake a managing approach where they provide musical support because they are the ones with all the musical knowledge, but they also activate participants, activating them in music making, and sometimes it went even a little bit further. For instance, asking them questions, okay, what do you want to produce? What do you want to learn? What type of music do you listen to? And sort of co-creating the program together with them. And then as a last one, it's also about fostering group cohesion. It's about letting everyone have a say and ranging in people that might dominate the group. And a program developer stated it as, there's a lot of non-verbal communication that goes on in a project. And as a facilitator, you need to watch out for these things. You need to watch out for bounces within the group, because obviously there are lots of strong characters and they will shout loudest, and they may squash the people that have something to say but are not quite comfortable enough to do it. It's about making the space feel safe for everybody to contribute at whatever level they feel comfortable. Then context. So context also has an influence on the program. And we divided context into micro, exo, macro systems. And on microsystem, it's about the music facilitator's motivation. They need to be genuine, authentic, because the participants sort of have a sixth sense that they can feel when someone is not being genuine. They also have a professional background in music education, or they are professional musicians. On exosystem, you have the prison environment, which very much has an influence on the program. For instance, security measures. Due to security measures, it was not possible to do a concert at the end, or prison staff needed to be present during the program, which is an influence on people expressing themselves. But also, for instance, the prison infrastructure. most of the times, most prisons don't have a specific music room, so these activities take place within the chapel or the gymnasium. But there's a lot of bad acoustics, or they're put in very small rooms which can get very loud, or there are external noises from the hallways or from other activities interfering and things like that. And then the last contextual factor on macrosystem level is financial support. Almost all respondents that I've talked to mentioned that the financial support is quite limited. They always need to find money somewhere, and due to the limited financial support, they were, for instance, not able to give a concert at the end, or they had to shorten their program, or they could only organize a program once and not more than once. So thank you for listening and for your attention, and I hope you found it very interesting.
Come on up. Yeah, so thank you. Have we got Silke online as well? Pop your video on if you don't mind. Hello. And Lucas is not there anymore. Yeah. Perfect. So this is our panel. We've got a hybrid panel. So thank you, and thank you for your presentations, everyone. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I think one of the things that struck me when I was listening to you all speak was this potential for intended but also unintended outcomes, and the potential for music in context of detention to have both positive impacts as well as neutral or indeed harmful outcomes. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Shall I throw to someone online? Elsa, maybe? Do you want to start with that one? And maybe if you're online, maybe just turn your videos off, except for our panelists, just for this bit. And then when we do our discussion, we can put our videos on. Oh, is Elsa online? Oh, thought that was Elsa's.
No, we have Silke online.
It's just Silke online. I thought that other person. Okay, Alexis, do you want to start us off?
I could actually tie it into something that Elsa said, which I thought was really important in thinking not what music can do, but what we want it to do, I suppose. And Elsa was talking about ideology and ideas of utopia. And I don't think this is unique to carceral context, right? We see it in schools, we see it here at SIMM, we see it in universities, in every sort of context, especially education contexts. They're quite often driven by normative, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad sense, but normative ideals of what we think is right and what we think is good. And I think that especially, it's probably amplified in carceral context, and maybe especially with young people who, they're still figuring this out, as we were all at that age, and some of us are still figuring it out, of who we want to be when we grow up and with whom we belong, where our community is. And for them to be able to have a space in experimenting, I suppose, with ideas and ideals of right and wrong in and through music. I think the danger is when we impose moral boundaries, I suppose, because in anything through music, if we're saying this is good, we were thinking about some of the socially conscious rap and things like this, which is really fascinating, but in saying, yes, this is how you can process this and this is how you can be a good citizen, then you're simultaneously saying, yeah, but this is not being a good citizen. So in drawing that boundary and saying what our aims are through music, you're also implicitly saying what we don't want you to be. And when we have such divided and inequitable settings, such as Australian youth justice, that very easily becomes an ideal of white middle-class citizenship, and with children being required to perform quite literally,
rehabilitation along those lines, rather than have that space for creativity and exploration and making mistakes and trying things on.
Thank you. Silke, I don't know if you have anything to add. Did you see similar tensions in some of your observations?
Yeah, so I totally align with what Alexis is saying. It's about creating this space where they can experiment and where they can be themselves and can see, okay, well, where they can make music and where they can show themselves through their music. And this can be in so many different ways. And it can also just be, for instance, a space where people can be outside of prison and where they can be themselves and sort of escape of the prison environment and things they're worrying about as well.
I could add something to that as well, because I don't want to suggest that this is also a laissez-faire, anything goes. I have no time for relativism, and I think that, and I know Silke's work, so I know that you have similar thoughts here, because it's not, you know, explore yourself in white supremacist punk, or however, you know, we still do have values in and through music and through education and through youth work and social work and these kinds of things, but I think it requires a critical reflexivity and a listening that music affords for young people to be able to articulate themselves in different ways, and for us to just sort of have a bit of space for that before we immediately launch for the pause button and declare something as problematic. So it's not a free-for-all kind of exploration, you know, see how many bad things you can play around with. But it is a questioning, I suppose, of what good music is, what music is good for, and the other implications of that.
Thank you. We've got a question in here, and then I might throw to online. So Kate, I don't know if you've got any questions in the chat. We've got one in the room. Oh, thank you. Microphone's just coming.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone who presented, for a very interesting, thought-provoking session. I guess I feel really concerned by some of this research, in large part because I guess it's less about concern about the policing of the kind of music that's made, and maybe more in the kind of like thinking with, I mean, Alexis, you were bringing up this idea of effective or affective abolition, and I guess that feels really concerning to me, because abolition, I guess it brings to mind for me Eve Tuck and Kay Wen-Yang's provocation that decolonization is not a metaphor. Abolition also is not a metaphor. And in what ways is this kind of thinking more about like making these places more palatable to us as people not in prisons at the moment, and less about, or even these kinds of ideas of prisons as rehabilitation services, which we know is not how they operate in this nation state or in any other, that they're, you know, continuing violent structures of like settler colonialism in action, that are about controlling societies. And in particular, thinking right now in a state that has just recently, a couple of months ago, suspended the Human Rights Act for the second time in order to keep children in prison, in police watch houses, in adult police watch houses for longer than 24 hours, and often for indefinite periods of time. And I know in your research you've noted quite often the amount of like kids who are held on remand. And so I'm concerned not so much that there is music in prisons and that might help make it palatable, but that your positions as researchers and the work that's doing to kind of be theorizing in this way helps to prop up the state and its actions and its continued violent actions in this particular setting, and that prisons are by design dehumanizing, and there's not really ways to make that kind of more palatable by making sure you're not dehumanizing individuals in a music setting, you know? I also am concerned that this is not research that's led by people with lived experiences. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Sisters Inside conference, literally just over that road, And I was disappointed that people who are involved in this kind of research weren't there, which is, you know, an organization that is dedicated to ending the imprisonment of particularly women and children or people in women's prisons, and really thinking with abolition, you know, and with like major figures internationally of abolition, including like distinguished Professor Angela Davis and others attending that conference. So I guess the question is like, what work do you see this research doing? And, you know, can you see the dangers of it playing into essentially, you know, providing support for even through criticism, because we know how academia works in order to kind of like be the nice little dissenting voice on the margin, but if it's kind of essentially propping up the state rather than providing any kind of challenge.
Thank you for that provocation. I'll throw to Alexis, but I just wanted to quickly say welcome to Elsa as well. Elsa, we did see your video and we're very glad you're with us. We're nearly wrapping up the session, but it's lovely that you are with us. And I don't know if you caught the end of that, but it'd be great to hear you respond. I'll throw to Alexis and then we can hear from you.
Thank you, Hannah. I love thinking with you. Yes, to all of that. I am acutely aware of the dangers of making youth detention a nicer place to be. We should not be incarcerating people, let alone 10-year-olds. And that refurnishing it with nice programs, or as Queensland is now doing, building a new prison that is a new youth prison which is rehabilitative, is creating another prison that's going to be filled. They're not going to close down the other ones for the rehabilitation, like they're all going to be filled. So yes, I'm acutely aware. It's something that troubles me daily in thinking what I'm doing and what for or who for. And I think there's two parts of it. So I see my work and myself as answerable to the best interests of the child, I suppose, without me necessarily dictating what that is. But if we have I'm trying not to swear, a really awful system, if we have a really awful system, that's not going to go away tomorrow, however much we might. No, it's true, but there is an answerability to children's well-being and trying to do what we can, right? But then there's also that systems level, and I really enjoyed some of the discussions yesterday of like, well, how do we trouble those systems level change? And I think that part of the reason why that's so hard is exactly what you've said. You've hit the nail on the head in that we're complicit. We're in a system of academia as well, which is not unrelated to carceral systems. It's not unrelated to ideals of white middle-class citizenship and so on and so forth. So in part of that troubling and systems provoking, we have to unsettle what it is we do and how we do it. That was a long-winded answer that didn't actually answer the question, but the question is really good and one that I'm still asking. So thank you for it. It's great.
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you for the question. There's so much more to talk about. We need to wrap up, but I just wanted to throw very quickly to Elsa. I don't know if you can respond to that in just a couple of sentences, or at least just say hello to us, maybe.
So hello, thanks for having me in the conference, although it's online. So I've been hearing you yesterday, and I think it's quite interesting to establish a comparison between what happens now and what happens in different systems and what happened before in Spain. And I didn't have the chance because of the time to establish a comparison on what happened during the dictatorship in Spain and what happens here now in prisons and how music is being implemented in prisons. from other perspective, just to try to rehabilitate or reeducate or prepare people to have a chance when they go outside the prison, and how this is, I think, a moral debate, because are we preparing them or offering them a therapy or a way to escape, or in a psychological way, the cureness of the prison, the high the risks of the prison, or are just continuing this perspective of reeducating in a way that these civilians are affordable to society. So I don't want to extend, because I think I am exceeding the time, but it's interesting to have all these topics in mind, because for me, and I think for most of you, is kind of a moral debate. If we are engaging people through music, or we are perpetuating this kind of, not punishment, but reeducation system, which is, there is some controversies sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. And we're out of time, but we have a keynote on this topic coming up, which will just be the perfect opportunity for us all to continue to think about this and to continue to discuss that. So I wanted to say thank you very much to all our panelists and to everyone online, and thank you very much to Kate for facilitating us online. We're going to have just maybe 5 minutes of just music and a stretch. Don't go too far. Our keynote won't be far away. Thank you.